Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. We are going to do some HTML5/JavaScript development with CNX's Valence framework a little bit later on in the webinar, and I think you're going to find that really, really cool and exciting. But first, I want to just log into the Valence Portal and just fast forward a little bit and show you what the end product looks like what kind of applications we're talking about. So we'll kind of just look things over a little bit, then we'll go and get into the actual development. So I'm going to sign into CNX test system. I just installed the Valence framework to this system fresh. So this is kind of like a clean slate. It's installed to the IBM I, and I'm just going here in my browser to this address so I can get the login screen. Now I'm using Google Chrome on a Mac. So my browser may look a little bit different than what you're used to, but if you use Windows and Internet Explorer, it's going to be, pretty much the same. So I'm going to just log in here as QSec Offer. By the way, by default, you can log in with any IBM I user ID and password, but there's a lot of different options you can take in that regard as to how you can integrate the security with the IBM I. But I'm just going to just log in quickly here, and essentially what we're seeing here is something we call the Launchpad. So these little icons represent all of the different apps that are included with Valence Standard. And you can see we have administration apps, development apps. There's some example apps. I'll open up, this is an interesting one, the paging grid example is just a simple program to show kind of like a paging subfile, right? You can just kind of page through one page at a time. We can kind of sort columns, move columns around, and do kind of fancy things like that. But it's just calling an RPG program on the IBM I to get the data, and it's being displayed in a really cool way in the browser. I'll open up a few more apps just to kind of show you how the portal works a little bit further. So I have 3 different apps open here, and I can just keep them open and move through them by just using these tabs. And as long as they're running within here, they're kind of being controlled by the Valence Portal security that's integrated with the security of the IBM I. So just a couple of the quick features worth noting. If I go to open up a new app, and let's just say I have a lot of apps in this list, I can search them really easily. Let's say I want to, look up something that has the word help in it. As I just start typing, it starts limiting those apps, and I can find them a lot easier, like, okay, one with a dock in it. Okay, so that's an easy way to kind of search for the apps. That's a cool feature. So if I click this little up arrow here, I get into an area called My Apps, and you can see it's blank for me right now. So let's just say I use portal administration a lot, for example. So if I grab this icon and drag it towards the top, I can drag it into this area, and it will add that to the My Apps. So when I go back there, you can see, okay, I have Portal Admin. That's kind of one of my favorites now. And let's take the paging grid and put it up there. And let's take test RPG call up there. I use that one a lot. Okay. Now when I go up there, I see these 3 apps. Now I can rearrange these here too. So I can move them around, so I can put them in the order that I like them as a user. Oh, that one didn't kind of move. There we go. Okay. So now if I was to log off, I'm going to log out now. And if I log back in, now it remembers that configuration, so that My Apps will always be there. So these will always be there, and I don't have to go down here and find them in the larger list. That's, again, a very popular feature. One of the things I want to show you as well, I'm going to log back out again. Sorry, I'm logging in and out a lot, but one of the cool features is that Valence is translated, well, the portal and most of the portal functions are translated into 8 different languages. We're also going to shortly be adding Polish, so it'll be 9 languages. So let's just say, for example, Spanish is a big one. I'm going to switch to Spanish. So now the login page, if I have an error, like let's just say I log in incorrectly, everything, the error messages and all that are switched to Spanish. And it's not just some kind of like simple Google Translate. It is an actual professional translation of all these different literals and messages. So let me just log in. I'll show you that a little bit further. So there you go. See, we have all that now is showing in Spanish. One last thing I would like to go through is portal administration, because this gives you a better feel of the power of what the portal can do for you. Oh, look at this. This is the users list, but I'm still in Spanish, so I'm gonna ask you to excuse me while I switch back to English again. Okay, so we're back in English. I'm going to run portal administration, and I'm just going to go through each one of these categories. So and just talk briefly about what they do. So settings, these are kind of like major settings for Valence and the Valence Portal, different paths to things, rules about passwords and IBM security integration, the appearance of the portal and dates and all kinds of different things, which, we could take an hour just going through each one of these. So I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. This is a list of users in Valence. Most of the time you don't have to go in and administer this. There's ways to set up the automated adding of users, like I could log in as any IBM user and it would automatically add this in here the way my current settings are set. The apps section will list all of the apps, that I have running through the Valence Portal. So if you as a developer were to create new apps of your own for your company, you would add them to this list and they would appear on the Launchpad so your users can launch them. Groups are ways to group apps together into like departments or other kind of security categories. And then you can authorize users to groups. And, that's one of the ways you can set security. The different categories are how the Launchpad appears for users when they first log in. So like development by default, like if I wanted to move some of these around or move them between categories, I could do that and save that, and then that would change all the defaults for that. Environments are really just kind of ways to set the library list, so you can have the user switch between environments, and that kind of effectively changes that library list. Languages are just sort of a list of languages and some parameters for those. When we include the Polish translation, we'll have that in there as well. Dev tokens are, it's kind of a little bit beyond what we want to cover in the webinar, but it's basically a way for developers to have extra level of openness for making calls to the RPG side without security. That's just a general overview of the portal. There is also, I'm going to go back here just to have that up while I'm talking. We also have a full-blown mobile portal. So if you go to the Apple App Store, you can download the Valence Portal, which is kind of optimized for iOS devices. You can also use the mobile browser, and you'll get kind of a mobile-looking portal. I'm not going to show that right now because you kind of get a feel for what Valence is all about just by looking at the desktop version. But a little bit later on in the webinar, when I get to doing development, we're going to be doing a mobile app after a desktop app, so you'll see the mobile portal at that time. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Robert Swanson here at CNX. Robert has prepared a few slides for you to help you understand how all this works and how it's structured. And then once Robert is done with that, I'll come back and we'll actually start doing some real development. I'll show you how to develop these apps, and I think you'll find that really interesting. So, okay, let's switch it over to Rob now.
Thank you, Richard. So before we get into demonstrating how to make an app like one of the ones Richard was just showing, I want to step back a moment and talk about the technology going on behind the scenes here with the Valence framework. At a macro level, you have your server side, a power system running IBM I, and on the client side, you have your PC browser, your mobile device, and in between the two, you have an HTTP layer, which in the case of Valence is running on the IBM I's integrated Apache server. Now you have data going back and forth between the two sides, and we'll talk more about that later, but right now I want to zoom in a little bit on the server side and talk about what's going on here. So for the UI in a traditional IBM I shop using green screens for the user interface, you have your RPG business logic intertwined with a lot of display file logic, which means you've got execute formats and subfile reads and writes and so forth all mixed in with the RPG code. And as with many other modernization initiatives in Valence, you're going to want to separate your business logic from the user interface logic and bring in a Valence service program. When bound to your RPG program, this service program gives you procedures you can use so you can communicate directly with the front-end UI components in the browser. Then you can leave all the fancy UI logic to the front end. So let's talk about that for a moment. In Richard's browser demo a moment ago, the secret sauce behind all those apps you saw was an HTML5 framework or a JavaScript framework called EXTJS, which is made by a company called Sencha, and Valence includes EXTJS in its framework. And the point of the framework is that it reduces or eliminates your need to code HTML and CSS and lets you focus more on the business logic, so you're not so consumed with the rigmarole of doing the browser code to get the user interface to look just right. This has been a big game changer in recent years for how web apps are developed. It means basically your server is no longer necessarily streaming HTML and CSS code to the browser, but instead it can send simple little JavaScript programs which inside the browser then execute and call APIs that write HTML code for you. So in the case of Valence, you might stream a JavaScript program from your IFS, which calls various EXTJS APIs. Those churn out some really cool graphical interface components in the browser, such as grids, charts, combo boxes with autocomplete, trees with drag and drop features, tab panels, menus, forms, date pickers, data views, progress bars, pop-up messages, and on and on and on. I'm only scratching the surface here, but the point is that you can use these frameworks to very quickly whip out some pretty elaborate user interfaces with very little code. Now, the key benefit to these frameworks is the abstraction they provide. And as developers on IBM I, we're pretty familiar with this concept. If you think about the lowest level of the machine as a bunch of ones and zeros, as RPG developers, we're separated from that by many layers of machine code that allow us to write in just a few lines of code to get some pretty elaborate functionality. In fact, we're kind of spoiled with how easy it is, for instance, to do database access with RPG. And some shops may even abstract themselves from the RPG with their case tools. Now, the corollary to this in the web world, starting at the HTML level, is that we can now abstract ourselves from that HTML code with a JavaScript framework. These frameworks will actually write some, or in some cases all, of the HTML code that renders the app, the UI of the app for the user. And lately, in the last few years, there's even been a way to abstract yourselves from the frameworks themselves with architect-type tools. And Richard's going to demonstrate this later in the presentation, but the nitty-gritty of the tool is that it lets you drag and drop your way to writing some of the JavaScript code, which really completely speeds up the process even further. So it's really been quite an evolution in the way these Web 2.0 type apps are being developed. And the key to it all is the JavaScript framework. And there are so many out there. I can only scratch the surface here, but there's jQuery, XJS, Dojo, Angular, React, Backbone. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Some frameworks are more suited to social media type applications. Some are more suited to business applications and so forth. And that's actually why Valence is paired up with EXTJS, because it has some really great business functionality, especially when it comes to grids, which are like subfiles on steroids. Now, if we drill into how Valence works with all this in mind, you're basically taking a browser and you have your IBM I and you point it to a specific URL. That will be directed by the IBM I's Apache server to the appropriate spot, which would then stream back a login page from Valence. The user can then log in with their credentials. It's validated on the IBM I and it sends back a launchpad. And then the user can just click on any app on that launchpad, and that will actually trigger the JavaScript program to be streamed from the IFS into the browser. And that's where the magic happens. The browser will basically run that JavaScript program, which calls the EXTJS APIs and generates the visual app for the user. So let's drill down a bit into our hypothetical dashboard app here and talk about what's going on. Basically, your front end might have many little parts of it that are calling independently various RPG programs on the back end to provide data for the visual to the user. And you might have many of these RPG programs, or it could be a single program with multiple procedures. But in any event, the way it works is you're going to send JSON, JavaScript object notation data to and send it back from the IBM I. And the Valence service program helps your RPG programs interpret this. So if we drill down into one of these examples and take a look at what might be happening, let's say we're going to have a program called CM1000, or an RPG program we want to call. And within that CM1000 RPG program, we want to do an action called getCustData, and we're going to pass it a customer number. Maybe that was typed into one of the fields at the top of the page. So the way this would work in Valence is you'd use a AJAX call, which is basically part of the framework, to send that JSON data, which would look something like this, to the IBM I. Now Valence will receive that call, and if you were quick on the draw, you could probably see that running in your Apache server instance. But what Valence does is it validates that incoming data, checks the security, makes sure that the library list is set properly, overrides the job user, and then it'll actually ultimately call the requested program. And this is where that service program comes into play, because you'll notice we got some procedures we can use to import data from the browser, as well as one to send data out to the browser. And the output will be converted back to JSON and then rendered in the page accordingly. Now, this particular RPG example is using native I/O to send data out to the browser, but there's many other ways to use the Valence service program, and a more common way is to use SQL. So, in a nutshell, what's happening with Valence is you have your back-end business logic written in RPG that receives JSON data from the front end. Your RPG does its thing after retrieving it through the service program and prepares a response. And then you use that Valence service program to convert your output into JSON that the front end can interpret, which will receive that JSON and update the visual components. And then you just kind of lather, rinse, repeat. That is, in a nutshell, how these single-page web apps work. And the key point is that Valence brings this functionality that's used on a lot of other platforms to the IBM I, so you can use it with RPG. It's a lot of fun. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it back to Richard, and let's go out and build an app now using this Valence technology.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. I'm actually going to create several Valence apps during this demonstration. I'm going to start by doing an inquiry, and then I'll move on to a little bit more complex file maintenance. And then we'll do a mobile app as well. Those are the three I'm planning on doing. Hopefully time will allow me to get to all the features of those three that I want to show. So let's start with the inquiry. And the first thing I'd like to point out is that when we start a new Valence app, you almost always want to start with Nitro Autocode. That is an automatic code generator that will set up certain kinds of programs for you. So let me go into that and I'll explain it further. Okay, so first of all, we have desktop type apps to auto-generate and then mobile type apps to auto-generate. So I'll get to the mobile later, but for desktop, we're going to start by creating a grid inquiry, but let me just explain to you what the differences between these three types are. So a blank project will essentially create a stub of an application, right? It creates a basic kind of blank screen front end and then a small RPG program that has all the Valence includes and everything in there. So it's a way to just generate some starting source files for you that you can then build upon. An inquiry is a little bit more complex in that you can specify either an SQL statement or a file name, and it will generate the entire app for you. And then file maintenance takes it a step further and adds all the things for adding and updating existing records and so forth, and we'll see that a little bit later. But anyway, we're going to just generate the first inquiry, and I'm going to just use a file name that's included with Valence called demo CMast. It's like a demo customer master file. You can put in any file that you have on your system, so this can be done with any of your database files on the IBM I. So when we click validate, it's going to go and validate that file and call in all the fields for that file. Now, when it creates the inquiry, we're going to have a grid on there, which is, like a subfile thing. And by default, it's selecting these fields for me that it's going to include on the grid. So I can say, all right, well, if I don't want year-to-date sales or the activity date on my initial grid, I don't have to include those. But you know what? I'll recheck those because that way we'll get to see what those fields have. And then there's going to be a search field at the top of the inquiry. And these are all the fields that when I type something in there, it will search on. So I'm going to take off year-to-date sales because you typically wouldn't want to search on that, but I'll leave all these others. The initial sort is sorting by the customer number when I first look at it. I think I'm going to change that to the customer name. That way we'll see them in alphabetical order. And there's some other ways I can configure the grid automatically. I'm going to leave all those unselected to keep it simple, but I'll also include a download because that's a popular feature that pretty much everybody likes. And that's it. I'm just going to leave all the other defaults and click Generate App, and it'll take a few seconds. Okay, so the app was generated, and here it tells you what it has done. It's generated this app ID in Valence Portal. It has put the project, which the user interface is coded in Sencha Architect automatically for you at this path on your IFS, and then the source code for the RPG program is AC1001, and it's located here in that RPG source file. Instead of clicking run, I could just click this button. It'll run the app right now. I'm just going to hit OK to kind of dismiss this pop-up and open up a new launchpad here just to show you that it has automatically added our demo CMast grid inquiry. Okay, so this is the new app that was created. And I'm just, I'm just going to bring it up here into, sorry, I dropped it. I'm going to bring it up here into my app section so that I can more easily run it up here. Okay, so let's just click this and get it started, and we'll see what we got here. Okay, so here's all the fields that we selected. I have a left and right scroll. I'll show you later how to get rid of that because I really don't like scrolling left or right, but there's an easy way to fix that. And I could have actually said during the generation that I wanted to force fit the columns to kind of fit into the width, but I left that unselected specifically so I could show you how to add that later in code. But this grid has standard built-in features, like it's initially sorted by the customer name. I can click the customer name heading again to reverse sort that. I could sort by city by clicking that. So any of these columns, that's kind of a standard feature in these kind of grids. I can also move columns around. That's pretty cool. Things like that. I could drop this thing down and say turn off certain columns if I don't want to see them. So the users have quite a bit of flexibility in what they can do with this data. The search capability is also pretty cool. Like if I want to type in, if I want to find, say, something Chicago, you can see, okay, so because of those search fields that I selected during generation, it's finding Chicago in the city, but like this one here, it's found Chicago in the name. So it's every field that I told it to search on, that's what the search is going for. So that's a really good functionality for the users. If I want to download the file, I chose during generation that I wanted to include a download. So when I click that, and now I get this Excel file here. When I open that up, there it is. Okay, so now I have it in Excel, and of course I can do whatever I want with it. So immediately you can see how powerful this is to be able to just generate any inquiry off of any file that you want and give the users this great search capability, download, and be able to do anything that they need to with those records. And one other thing I want to point out here is we have a paging grid. We can kind of page through the records, go to the end, go to the beginning, refresh the data. All those functions are down here. Now you could say, well, now that I have this app, what if I want to add something to it? Or what if I want to change something about it? This is where the GUI designer comes in, called Sencha Architect. And all of the apps that are generated by Nitro AutoCode, you remember we started from Nitro AutoCode. This generated the app for me automatically. So AutoCode automatically generates Sencha Architect metadata. Like if you were in Sencha Architect GUI designer and you were to design all this yourself, the output of that is what AutoCode generates for you. So we have the ability to open this app that AutoCode created for us in Sencha Architect, and we can modify it from there. This is why I was saying earlier that we normally always start apps with Nitro AutoCode, even if it's just a simple blank project, because it just gives you a starting point that saves a lot of time that you can then open in Architect and build off of. And let me just show you here. I'm going to go into my Mac Finder. This is equivalent to Windows Explorer, if you're familiar with Windows, of course. I already mapped a drive into my IFS on the IBM I to my Valence 4.1 folder. Let me just point this out to you so it's a little bit more clear. Valence has a tool called the Nitro Source Editor, and in there, it has a really good IFS Explorer. So I'm not really going to do any coding in this source editor here, but I'm going to use it to just show you this is my IFS root, and when you install Valence on your system, this is Valence 4.1, it creates this folder for you. So this is the folder right here that I mapped into on my Mac, and this is the folder that you would create a mapped drive to from Windows if you were using Windows. So if we open up the Finder and go to this mapped drive, I would go under the desktop folder because this is a desktop app versus mobile. I would click AutoCode apps, and then this is where my AutoCode apps are generated. Now I could subsequently move this app somewhere else on my IFS, but this is where they're generated by default. So there it is. This is everything that's required for the user interface portion of that app. And this XDS file is a Sencha Architect. That's the file that you start with when you open it from Sencha Architect. All right. So I'm going to launch Sencha Architect in my Mac. And again, don't be afraid by the fact that I'm opening this up on my Mac. This looks exactly the same in Windows. You do it the same way. Once we get into Architect, it'll look the same as it would on Windows. So here, I'll just go back so you can see the path again. That's my map drive. I'll go into Desktop, AutoCode apps. There it is, AC1001. And I'll just click on the XDS file and we'll open it up in Sencha Architect. It'll take a few seconds. And there it is. So, flashed a couple times. All right, so this is the canvas, we call it. This is the visual part of the app, and then all this stuff around it is the tools for modifying the app, right? I'm going to close this down just a little bit here so we can have more canvas room. That's as small as that gets. Okay. Now let's just say, we can't go through and demonstrate all of the features of Sencha Architect. It's kind of a full-blown GUI designer, but I'll show you a few features, right? So like, let's just say I want to change the title on this grid panel. I can simply, double click it and say my demo CMAST inquiry or whatever you want to call it. And then, okay, the titles of these columns this was just pulled from the database file, like for the address line 1, that's the text in the database file. So that doesn't look like a good title. So we'll say, just say like address line 1, okay. Address line 2. Oh, I guess there's 2 address. No, that's right. Okay. City, state. Okay, the rest of these look okay. All right. So now let me just save this. So it's saving back to the IFS. Now I can go back to the portal, and I could just close the app and reopen it, and then I'll get the new version. And there it is. You can see now it says address line 1, address line 2. I changed the title. So it's really that simple, okay? So let me go back to Sencha Architect. And remember earlier I was saying I really don't like left and right scrolling? Well, that's easy to fix. I can go to the grid here, and there's a property on the grid called force fit. And basically, before I change this, I'll just say, all the properties, if I just click on the main file grid here, all the properties that I can change on the grid are here. So one of them is force fit. I didn't want to scroll through the list, so I was just filtering it here. Force fit. Check that. Now when I save that, and there's a little shortcut to refreshing this in Google Chrome. I can right-click anywhere here and say reload frame, and that'll reload the application. Now you can see it has proportionally squeezed all of the columns so that I don't have any more left and right scrolling. That's a real nice feature. So if I change the size of the browser, it will automatically keep everything squeezed in there. See that? Okay. So I'm calling this app complete then. I showed you how to use AutoCode to automatically generate the app. We went into Sencha Architect. We opened up the app that AutoCode automatically generated for us. We made some changes. Now we could make much more complex changes, but you kind of get the idea. Now, from within Architect, every single thing about this application, from the colors to the titles to the functionality of this to what columns are shown, is all editable. And it's pretty straightforward on how to do that. For the more complex features, we have training classes, and there's a lot of online information, on how to teach yourself how to use this Sencha Architect. But let's now move on to the a little bit more complex file maintenance. And again, so I'm going to close that one down. Again, we're going to start with AutoCode. And let's, just to keep it simple, we'll use the same file, demo CMAST. Now when I validate this one, I get some more columns here of options, right, than we did with the inquiry. So the fields I want to show on my initial grid are these. We'll leave them all. Which ones I want to search on? I don't want to search on the sales. When we add a record, a window is going to pop up. So on the add window, which fields do I want the user to be able to key into? Well, I don't want them to be able to key in year-to-date sales or the activity date. That's kind of handled automatically by program logic. So we only want them to key in these fields. When they're editing a record, what do we want to allow them to edit? I don't want them to be able to edit the customer number, but I do want that on the screen, so we'll make that read-only so they can see the customer number but not edit it, okay? And we also don't want them to be able to edit year-to-date sales or the activity date. So we'll just say those are read-only, okay? Now, initial sort, we'll leave that as the customer number. That really doesn't matter for our demonstration purposes. Do I want to allow the user to delete a record? Yes. Stripe the rows is kind of just a visual thing. Maintain state is if the user moves columns around or turns columns on or off. This will maintain the state in a cookie on the browser so that the next time they go into it, it'll remember that state. Force fit, I'm going to check that. That's what I changed manually on the inquiry from Sencha Architect. But if I check that here, it'll add that for me as soon as it's generated. Lines on the column is kind of like stripe rows. Column lines is like put lines in between, each column. Generally, I like my grids a little bit cleaner. I'm also going to include a download on this one, and we'll leave all the other options. Actually, one more thing I'll point out is the program name it gave me on the previous one. It was like AC1001. That just means autocode 1001. It's the first one created. The program name will be generated for me automatically if I just leave that star auto. That's fine. You could give it a name. Here I'll just say generate app. And now on this one I'll say run now, and it'll launch the app for me automatically. Now it looks kind of like the inquiry. You see my force fit? It automatically did that for me. But I have a few extra things on this one. I have a plus sign that will allow me to add a record. Okay. And I also have this little menu item over here. When I click this, it gives me edit, copy, or delete. Now, remember I said I was allowing the user to delete record. If I didn't check that, this option wouldn't be on there. Okay. You can also, so you can edit by clicking this. All right. It's editing that existing record. And remember I said customer number, year-to-date sales, and the activity date were all read-only. So you see I can't change those, right? And I can also, instead of clicking this and hitting edit, I could also, I think, just double click one of the rows. That also works. Okay. A copy it just basically calls up all the records, ignoring the read only, so that I can edit the customer number. And in this case, I would change the customer number. If I try to hit save on this, it's giving me an error saying duplicate key value, so we can't add that, right? I'd have to change the customer number and resave it because that's the key in the file. Now on the grid inquiry program, I didn't show you the RPG that was automatically generated. So let's take a moment and just get a peek of that RPG program. I'll just open up my 5250 emulator here on my Mac and go into PDM. That's the easiest way for me to show this to you. All right, since those two programs start with AC, they're here. So these are the two RPG programs that were automatically generated by AutoCode for me. And I'm going to go into this file maintenance one. And let's just take a look at the structure here. You can see the first thing I have is an H-spec inclusion. This is one of those things that Valence RPG programs require. There's some things in there that it requires. And if I page down a little bit further, there's a D-spec inclusion. And if I go down a little bit further, I can see this is obviously this is free format. But in the main line here, what I have is a select statement, and the front end will pass a field or a parameter called action. And depending on what action it is, it will call a different procedure within this RPG program. If I'm getting the records for this grid, it's going to pass an action of get recs. If I'm getting a single record, it's just get rec singular, add a record, update a record, delete a record. So all these different procedures handle those different actions. So I'm going to show you real quick on the front end. If I open up Google Chrome Tools, if you go to More Tools, Developer Tools, that's what opens this up. And if I go to Network, this will monitor the network traffic between my browser and the IBM I and the Valence Apache server instance calling my RPG programs. I'm going to just clear the list here. Now, let's just say if I refresh the grid. So this line item here represents the call made to the RPG program. So if I click on that and hit headers, it'll give me information about what was sent to the RPG program. Here, this shows in the query string parameters is the program called was AC1002. That's the RPG program. The action passed was get recs. And this is some information about what page I'm on, how many records to get, the sort. I'm currently sorted by the customer number in ascending order, and these are a couple of other things, session ID. And so then you can see we look at the RPG program, when the action is get recs, then it's going to call this procedure get recs. So if I scroll down to that procedure, Let's get down here. Okay, so this is what it's doing. It's setting up an SQL statement. So this is a basic statement. Select all these fields from demo CMAS. Because I said I wanted to search on all these different fields, it's putting in that where clause. So effectively, all this is doing is building up an SQL statement based upon my needs. And if I scroll down to the bottom of this, this is some stuff for creating a spreadsheet if I do a download. But this is really what it comes down to here. I'm having a hard time selecting that. But this statement right here says VV out is part of the Valence RPG toolkit, and it has this procedure in it called exec SQL to JSON. So it just passes the STMT here, all right? And that's basically a character string of the SQL statement I want to run. So it'll execute that statement and then return the results in the JSON format. So if I go back to the browser and look at the response from the reload of that grid, actually it all appears on one line. So I'm going to go to preview, and that'll help me format it better. So these are all the individual records in JSON format, and that's the format that this component on the screen needs to load the data and show it to you in this manner. So the RPG program becomes really simple because of this RPG toolkit. You just pass it the SQL. So the task just becomes, how do you take the parameters and the information that the front end is passing you and construct the proper SQL statement out of it to get the response that you want. So that's a little bit a preview of how the RPG works. So if you're an experienced RPG developer, the RPG side of this should be kind of a no-brainer for you, or it should be a very short learning curve. Another thing I'd like to show you in this program is how we can do an edit check. And we'll actually make a change to the RPG program in a moment here. Here, I'm going to I'll open up CNX's record here in the customer master. Or let's just say if the zip code is blank, then I'm going to get an error message. So if I blank out this zip code and hit save, look, it's allowing that. There's no edit check there. And so if I go back in there, yeah, it's totally gone. Okay, so what I want to do is I'll change the RPG program to check to make sure a zip code was entered and send back an error message to the user interface here if the zip code is blank. Now, you could say, well, that check should be on the front end. Yeah, you can add it to the front end user interface as a check as well. But for data integrity, it's always best to put your edit checks on the back end in addition to that on the front end. But in this case, I want to show you how to add that to the RPG program, so we'll just add it there for now. So what I want to do is first, I'm going to find out what action am I performing when I hit save. So if I open up my Google Chrome tools, I already know what it is, but I want to show it to you here. So when I hit save, that's the save being performed. So what is it sending to the RPG program? It's sending an action of update rec, okay, and it's sending the value for all the fields. So the action I want to look for is update rec, all right? Because that's the one I want to change. I want to put an edit check in there. Here, I'll just search for it. All right, here it is. So in the update rec, there's some notes in here on how to add an edit check, right? So I'm going to insert a line here, and I'm going to say if VVIN, and the field name that I'm checking is czip. Okay, that's blank. That's the field name. So VVIN underscore car will get a character value of what the front end is sending in, czip. Okay, so if czip is equal to blanks, I'm going to close the end if there. Then what I will do is do send error message zip cannot be blank. All right. And I think I can add a second parameter to this. If I include the field name that's in error to send that back to the user interface, it'll actually position the error message right at the field in question. So what I can do here is insert a second parameter called czip, and that will tell the user interface that that is the field that's in error. So let me compile this. Make sure Valence 4.1 is in my library list. And then I'll just compile this with a 14. Okay, it compiled successfully. I'm going to close down the Google Chrome tools. Now, I shouldn't have to reload the user interface because it was just an RPG change when it calls the RPG program again. Now, the error message that's displayed next to the field, it can't be any longer than the field itself. It's because of the way the system lays out the fields, but you could make the zip code field display longer to be able to include a longer error message. But let me just show you if I don't include the zip parameter, it will bring it up here as a general error message in here. I can clear that just by typing something else in there. And then see, it'll come up here, error zip cannot be blank. It's kind of like it'll stay there for a few seconds and then go away. So there's also that option if you want to do that. You can go through if you have a more complex file. Obviously, you have really complicated error checking. You just add all that to your RPG and you just put those edit checks one after another. As soon as you encounter some kind of an error, you just send an error message back and return out of the procedure, and that will stop the record from being saved. Oops. Okay, to start off a mobile application in Valence, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with Nitro AutoCode. Let's run that. And okay, this time, before we were in the desktop area, this time we're going to be in the mobile area. And we want to do a list inquiry in this case, which is similar to the grid inquiry we were doing for desktop, only when you're on a mobile device, we tend to call it a list inquiry. It's not really a full grid. Well, let's use the same file, demo CMAST. And then by default, AutoCode is choosing the first 3 fields in the file for us. So on a mobile device, you don't have that much space horizontally, usually. So it only wants to choose 3 field. So let's just choose 1. I find it looks really clean when you just have like the customer name by itself. And then you'll have the opportunity to click on a record on the screen to get more details. So we'll include all the fields when you touch the record. Let's sort the list by the customer name. And then we'll leave all the rest of the defaults and hit generate app. So now AutoCode is generating a mobile application for us automatically. And I'm going to click you know what, I'll click Run now and just show you what it looks like in Chrome. So this is really a mobile application. I have to use my mouse to hold and drag so I can scroll through it, much like you would put your finger on a smartphone or a tablet to scroll. And let's see, the search should work. There you go. So now what I want to show you is what this would look like on an actual mobile device, and I'm going to minimize this Chrome browser here. And then I'm going to open up my, let's minimize that as well. Okay, there's my iOS simulator. I have this on my Mac, which can simulate an iPhone on screen. And if you have an iOS device like an iPhone or an iPad, you can go to the App Store and install the Valence Portal. And that's what I've done here onto the simulator. So when I run that, get my login screen. I'm going to type in my password, but I'm going to drag this down off the screen so you can't see what the characters are as I type them. The iPhone shows the characters to you 1 character at a time as you type before obfuscating them. Okay, so let me go log in now. Okay, now this has the same categories as the desktop portal, and every app that is mobile compatible will show in this portal. Okay. So this is exactly what you'd see on your iPhone, and this is the demo CMAS list inquiry that I just created. So if I just touch that, and there's your list, and you can kind of drag and scroll through it, loading more records, some at a time. There we go. And if you touch on one of them, there's the details. So it's Aetna and all the different fields that I've chosen. All right. So that's the app. It's a pretty simple app. But it's an app that you can call up in Architect, just as the desktop app you could do, and you can expand on it. So there you go. Again, search works fine. So let me show you now how we can open this app up in Architect and what it looks like. So I'm going to open up Architect again. Open. And we'll go to Mobile. Autocode apps, and there it is, AC1003. Okay, there's the app. So now let's just say, it has a search by default on there. Let's say for whatever reason you didn't need the search. I'm just going to do something simple on this for sake of time. So we can click on search and we'll right click and just delete that from the app. All right, and then that search existed on a toolbar, and now we have a blank toolbar. So we can just delete the toolbar as well because we don't need that anymore. So when I save it, all right, now I'll go back to my simulator, and then we'll just run it again. And there you go. So now it's the same application, only without the search bar on it. And from within Architect, I can add anything I want. I could add pop-up windows, ability to add records, delete records, things like that. Okay, we have a few minutes left, so I want to just show you some other tools that are included with Valence. These are things that are created with Valence itself, so it gives you a really good idea of the kind of things you can do, as well as showing you some of the tools that are included with it. This first one here is a test RPG call. This is a front end, kind of what would you call a generic front end that can call any Valence compatible RPG program. And I'll show you an example here. One of the programs that was created automatically by the Nitro Autocode, the first one was the grid inquiry, and that program it created was AC1001, and it has an action to load the grid records of get recs. So if you just put your program name in and your action, and you can include other parameters if the RPG program requires that, you just click test call, it'll go out and call that program, and it'll show you what the response looks like. This is a formatted response in JSON, and those are all the individual records. That's the raw response, unformatted. And these two tabs are really helpful when you really get in deep in Valence development. This is actually generating JavaScript for you that defines all the field names in that response. And there's different versions of that output you can get here. And when you're using the GUI designer, Sencha Architect, you can actually download this definition and import that into Architect, and it'll make that call for you automatically. It's extremely helpful and time-saving when you're developing applications. Okay, so that's Test RPG Call. Another one I want to look at, I think, is Nitro Source Editor. I opened this up earlier in the webinar, but I just wanted to point out to you some more features of it. If I go back into the Valence 4.1 folder here, you can see this has full-blown IFS manipulation. I can copy folders or individual files. Let's just open this up here. So this is an individual file. I could copy that file and paste it somewhere else. I can delete folders, move them around. Archive, meaning I can zip folders and I can transfer and download things directly to my PC, from here and upload them. And it's really fast. It's here at CNX, everybody goes to this in order to manipulate stuff on the IFS because it's so much more convenient than anything else out there. You can obviously edit raw text files with it. This is an app file. Let me not open that one because that's not a good example. That's just an HTML file that could be edited. We do most of our editing in Sencha Architect or other editors, but if you need to edit something in a pinch, this is really, really helpful. Let me just call up here, see if I can find something that's a little nicer to open up. Let's see if we go into the examples, Architect, barcode chart. Let's take a look at this one. So this is an example, of a file that can be edited and saved. So basically any text file can be edited there. So that's the Nitro Source Editor. Now let's take a look. Next one, let's look at Nitro IAdmin. This is a kind of a full-featured app to help you administer your IBM I in a graphical way. Here's a couple messages waiting. So I can just look at these messages waiting on the system and I can respond to them. If I click respond, these are the different options I can respond with. And I can just take the response there. Like, for example, I'll cancel that one. So now that one's been canceled. Jobs on hold, don't have any right now. CPU percentages, the current subsystems, and then I can drill down and look at all the jobs in the subsystem. And I can perform certain actions on those jobs, hold and get the job details. Okay. Look at system operator messages. I can see that that's the one I replied to. It looks like maybe it generated another message there, but I can look at ALQs. This is a really popular feature. I can, so these are the ALQs that actually have files in them. So if I click there, and this one has 2 pages. So when I click on that, I can see, well, that's not a very good printout. Let's see if I can get a different one. Okay, so that's the spool file I can just call right up here. That's the ALQ built right into IAdmin. You can look in devices, users. There's a lot of things in here. I don't have too much time left, so I'm not going to go into everything, but this is a really excellent tool for managing the IBM I. And there's also a mobile version of this that you can use as well from your smartphone or tablet. Thinking of ALQs, I also wanted to point out there is a separate spool file viewer which is convenient to give to your end users. Like Nitro IAdmin with all these features in it, you don't want to give these all these features to your users, but if you want your users to be able to look up spool files, this can be limited to the ones they have access to. So let's say you can just take a look at the spool files, and that one's got a ton of them in there. But so your users can then call up and look at any of the spool files. Okay, and the last tool I want to show you in Valence is the Nitro file editor. I'm going to go in there now. And it's just what it sounds like. You can just open up any file on your IBM I and edit it. I'm just going to use our same demo CMAST file we've been using, but you can utilize any file name from any library on your system. So go ahead and open the demo CMAST. And you can see we get an initial list of records. We can page through the records one at a time. We can choose to sort the records any way we want. Like, for example, I'll take the state column, and if you just drag it up to the sorting order toolbar here, we can first sort by state, and then we can sort by city within the state. And I'll get rid of the initial customer number sort here by clicking this X. So we're sorted by state and then by city. You can see that here. You can edit the records just by clicking on a record, and it'll open up an inline editor there, and you can delete and copy records from here. You can also go up here and add a record by clicking the plus sign. You get a little window for adding it. You can position to records by key with that feature. You can download records, and under this configuration, you have options to configure various ways that this screen can look. There's also a Nitro Query, which is kind of like a query tool, and a lot of documentation and other tools within this, but I'm kind of out of time, so I'm just going to pass it back to Tammy now so that we can move into the question and answer period.